mental health. We are so glad you're with us tonight, and we're glad that you're here. This is an ongoing conversation.
Really specialize a lot with teens and young adults, just with the everyday stressors and demands that oftentimes accompanies that stage of life, whether it's anxiety, depression, school stress, relationships with peers or parents, as well as the general life transition of high school to college into adulthood. And
I'm a licensed clinical social worker, licensed North Carolina and South Carolina. I'm a Harding University grad. Some of you, I know, we have that in common. Also University of Maryland, Baltimore for my master's degree. I was in private practice for over a decade in Maryland before I moved to Charlotte and kind of went over into healthcare. So I serve currently as a social work supervisor for Levine Cancer and work with cancer patients, their families, counseling going through the illness, as well as caregivers, and provide support groups for them. So a little different kind of practice, but I love it, and hopefully can be of some help.
We're glad you're with us, Ann. Morgan?
Hey, I'm Morgan Lavender. I have been in community mental health for around 10 years. I specialize in primarily
Remember our number that you can text questions. We're going to go ahead and start with first.
and there are a lot of periods of time where people go through periods where they're more sad than others, or may say something about, hey, I'm just kind of depressed, and as a way to describe. But actual clinical depression is when the severity levels increase. So how you can kind of know if it's different between a clinical depression versus a situational kind of everyday stressor that has caused some depression is both the intensity of the symptoms and for how long it goes on. So normally, if something is going on
So, Jonathan, when you think about depression, are there different types of depression, and what are some of the symptoms that may come along with each type?
Great question. And in a lot of ways, the research tells us that most people are going to have some type of depressive episode at some point in their life. The statistics just sort of show that to be true. It's also the number one most diagnosed mental health disorder in all of the world. And so there's something unique about our brain and facing adversity, discouragement. In a lot of ways, depression is especially, I think, important to talk about in the faith community, because a lot of the faith, in the faith tradition, which really then, again, it permeates in the way you think, how you feel, what you do. For some people, though, they'll have a period of some type of episodic phase of life where it is depression. It's debilitating. It interferes with their life. But whether it be through kind of just developmental as a young person, through hormonal, emotional transitions and changes that's going on in life, whether it's grief and loss, somebody that you love, sometimes through just time and care and understanding, you're able to move out of that period. And so that's what we would oftentimes call just sort of an episodic, a singular. But then there's what we would call reoccurring depression, where it's very cyclical, it's kind of predictable, and sometimes we can go even from moderate to severe, and that will kind of, again, help us understand the difference some folks can, in their own lives or people they know, struggle with seasonal depression, where just the mood and the atmosphere or other external variables seem to greatly impact how you're processing mood and energy and things along those lines. And I'll let others kind of share some other differentiations of depression.
One of the things, I guess, in terms of distinguishing type is always ruling out if there's a medical condition. I think because I work in healthcare, I see that. And about 40% of cancer patients experience depression. It's obviously a very difficult trial, so it's something that we see often. But there are other factors: thyroid, blood sugar, cardiac issues, and in reverse, untreated depression can also cause physical problems. So it can go either way. So I think it's important to, if you think you're experiencing it, to get an opinion from even a physician to start with, because there may be something physical that needs to be addressed, and that would be one distinguishing factor of a type of depression.
And I would add two other types. So a lot is talked about with perinatal and postpartum depression. Mm-hmm. So that's very unique in during pregnancy or up to a year after a child is born. And then you also have bipolar disorders fall under the depression for clinical depression, which is, so bipolar is kind of a combination of depression periods along with cycles of periods of mania. So kind of not opposite of depression, but very heightened mood and intensity of mood, almost opposite of depression. And so bipolar, that cycle, is also another form of depression.
Morgan, is it important to know the type of depression that you have?
So yes and no. It is important to know the type of depression you have for the reason that different types of depression also respond to different types of treatment, right? Knowing severity of depression, there's a lot of different treatment options that would not be available if you didn't have severe depression, right? If you have severe depression, there's certain treatment elements, medications, and different therapy options available. But one of the things that I would say, kind of leaning on the no, is it's really important that you know your diagnosis if you have clinical depression, so you can get adequate treatment. But one of the things I think is most important is not letting the diagnosis that someone has define them as a person. And so that's really important for a couple of reasons. It's really easy if you have a diagnosis, you can educate yourself and we can break down stigma, but it also can be something that diagnosis completely ends up defining them. And so everything about their life becomes about that diagnosis, or everyone in their family only sees them as a diagnosis. And it's really important to distinguish that difference, right? You wouldn't, I say a lot, there's things that are called like say this, not that. And you can do that for anything, intellectual disabilities, mental health, but it's really making sure that the language that we're using is talking about the person and not the attributes associated with them, right? So if you think about it, oh, he's depressed. If you flip the language over to he's a person who has depression, it's a lot different because you recognize that if you take the diagnosis away, there's still a person. And that goes a long way in reducing stigma. So yes, it's important to know diagnosis and get treatment that's appropriate, but it's not letting the diagnosis become that person.
Ann, anything you would add?
Oh, I just say amen. I just say amen. But yeah, I think that's true, because we wouldn't say to someone, oh, there she goes, she's a diabetic, or, she's a heart patient. And so true depression, clinical depression is a medical condition just like other things. And so, yes, we need to be careful in our language.
I would also add that what Morgan shared is especially significant with depression, because clinical depression often is accompanied by this great sense of not just hopelessness, but worthlessness. And because of that, it really is critical that we check how we are thinking about ourselves and the diagnosis, because if we lose hope and we feel like we have no worth, that really opens up the door to a lot of really scary and really harmful and detrimental thoughts and ideas and options of what to do in life or how to cope with the pain that they're experiencing.
Well, speaking of coping with pain that's experiencing, Ann, I'm going to ask you this question. What are the signs for people that they may need to seek help with depression?
I think we've honestly spoken to a lot of them. It's that persistent low energy, feelings of hopelessness, worthlessness, can't get up in the morning. Maybe, they can't function in their day-to-day life. Tearfulness. I know I saw a patient last week that just, every time I see her, she cries. And she doesn't really have a reason to cry. She just starts to cry as soon as she talks because she feels, just an overwhelming sadness. And so it's really important to intervene, I think, and try to give some hope of this can get better, and not, instead of letting a person continue on and on down that path without hope of something changing it and making it better.
And Morgan, what does that look like for children and also for teens?
A lot of the same as you see in adults for depression, although some of the social isolation doesn't happen as often. It can. You see a lot of irritability. You see a lot, the younger the child, the more kind of tantrums and crying episodes you'll see. Regression in sleep often occurs as well, difficulties with sleep. But a lot of the depression symptoms in teenagers mimic a lot of the depression symptoms in adults, except for there's a fine line because teenagers have bad days and hormones, and there can be moodiness. And so a lot of times depression symptoms can be masked in what people think of, oh, that's just a kid. They're just having a bad day. They're just being moody. And so being really mindful, again, at the persistence, right? Is it a bad day every day? Or is this happening every day? Is this not going away? Because that is a sign that it's not normal, even for a kid or a teenager or hormones.
Yeah, especially, I work a lot with teenagers and young adults, and it's just so difficult to pinpoint depression and how we sort of observe it as families. I'll get a large portion of young people come in, their parents are dragging them in, and the teenager is just protesting, I'm fine, there's nothing wrong. If anything, it's my parents. They're way overbearing, and every little thing is a big thing to them. But other times I'll have young people advocating to come in, and they say, I've been trying to convince my parents for months that there's something not right. and I don't know what it is, and they try to help or they try to just sort of overlook it because, like what Morgan has said, it's like so much of this mimics everyday life as a young person. And with such emotional disruption that is so internal, you can't necessarily pinpoint it. You just know what's going on inside you. It can be very confusing, disorienting, scary. And then how do you communicate and convince that to your parents if your parents sometimes say, well, you tend to make excuses for everything, or, everything, you overuse the language that you're depressed, things of that nature. For a lot of people that I see, they don't come in saying, I'm depressed. I mean, that's really a lot of times it's just a natural way of describing something that maybe has very little nuance. We know it's not sadness, but I have a lot of people come in and they say, we've observed they are losing interest in things that they were really passionate about for so long, and we're kind of worried about that. We notice they are isolating more. They're pulling away from their friends. We hear more everyday language of like, what's the point? This doesn't matter. What difference does it make? And so their motivation in certain particular areas of life, you just see an erosion of that. You also, when we think of depression, the first thing we think of is just sadness, but I hear a lot of people come in, I'm numb. Like, I don't feel anymore. I don't feel joy. I don't feel scared. I just feel numb to life. And they're able to recognize that. The other thing with young people, with young adults, and then especially with men, I work a lot with men, is if they come in and there is some reoccurring, persistent, problematic use of alcohol and drugs, because we know that there's a high correlation, there's a strong relationship with substance misuse and mental health. And even a lot of times people will say, well, alcohol is a depressant. If you stop drinking, you'll be less depressed. But a lot of times that's the chicken and the egg dilemma. It's like, are these people drinking and that's making them depressed, or are they turning to alcohol because they're depressed and they want a quick, immediate something that makes them feel something different other than that internal pain and numbness that they feel? And then a lot with you guys have described irritability. And I know you guys have a series you're going to talk about anger, and there's just a lot of overlap. That anger is one of those key features of depression, especially male depression, and that's oftentimes what can get overlooked, as we assume it's going to be excessive emotionality and tearfulness and sadness, and that is true. But we do see a lot of acting out, a lot of physical acting out and anger and irritability with men, young men, and depression.
I would add one more thing. It's not going to get better, there's no hope kind of conversation also goes even further. So, right, when you have clinical depression, you also have individuals who will have suicidal thoughts. So, I don't want to be here anymore. This place would be better without me. All of those are also very clear and direct signs that someone would probably need to get help. But it can be nuanced as far as, like, what's the point? It doesn't matter. Those are ones that also kind of come out a lot with kind of looking at that hopelessness versus hope and how much of that remains as well.
Morgan, a few minutes ago, you talked about saying this, not that. So for those of us who may have family members or friends who may be in the throes of depression, what are some things that we should say and what are some things that we shouldn't say? So part of it is always going to depend on the person because, right, every single person experiences depression a little bit different. One of the things I would say, right, just snap out of it or think differently, not very helpful with individuals who have depression. If they could snap out of it or think differently, they would have chosen to at that point. So, that's very simple, and most people wouldn't even think of that, but it comes out a lot from people. Hey, I've said this before in these conversations, hey, it's okay, it's gonna be okay. Again,
it may be okay, and we want to find ways to instill hope, but at the moment that they're sharing with you, that may not be the most ideal. But there's practical things that you can do as well. So if you think about depression, we talked about there's a lot of feelings of worthlessness. There's also a lot of feelings of guilt and shame that they can't move past the depression. So like a very practical thing that I think of, when someone is sick or has a loss, people bring food. If someone is really, truly in severe depression, asking, hey, text me if you need me, is probably not the most ideal, because a person with depression is likely not going to tell you they need you because they feel bad about the fact that they now need help. And so saying something like, hey, I'm going to drop off food, which day of the week is better? Like making an actual practical plan instead of asking them to reach you is probably a much more concrete way to help someone. Because again, they don't want to ask because they're already feeling kind of guilty and feeling worthless that they can't do that on their own. So finding ways to kind of change some of that language so that they may not have to ask, but you volunteer and you proactively have that conversation is a very practical thing.
I guess the first thing that came to my mind, honestly, is to listen. It's not what you say. It's to listen, to be there, to let that person know I'm here for you. We all need safe people we can talk to. It doesn't have to be a therapist. But for optimum mental health, I like to call it our inner circle. We all need 2 or 3 people that we know we could call any hour of the day or night. It could be our spouse, it could be a best friend, it could be a sibling, a parent. But we all, for ideal mental health, need those people that we know will just listen to us. So I guess the things that came to mind aren't that clinical. It's just listen, be there, say I love you. No matter what you're going through, I'm here for you. I love you. And, then maybe to do something practical, kind of like along with what Morgan was sharing about food, is let's take a walk. How about we go bowling? Let's just, just to do something. All of us, I'm sure all of us have had mornings we get up and we don't want to go to work, right? But we do, or we don't want to do something. But once we start moving and we do it, we find it's pleasant. So for people that are depressed, sometimes getting them moving towards something positive can also be very helpful. And of course, having the social connection, having that camaraderie and doing it with someone can be meaningful as well.
Yeah, the piece that you guys talked about, community, connection, and activity. So Kent, you originally asked, what to try to avoid. And I think that's really important to understand when it comes to depression, that I have this motto both in my own life as a husband and father of 2 teenage daughters, and this is also something that I say almost every day in a session. There are sometimes nothing you can say will make things better. But you can always say something that makes it worse. And a rule of thumb,
Can I get an amen on that?
if you don't know for sure what to say that's going to make it better, and then what we've talked about here, then really focus on connection, because depression is an isolating illness. It feeds and lives off of disconnecting a person from themselves and disconnecting people from others. So reaching out, not even just making an invitation, reach out. And then activity, because the more we can get the brain activated and focused on something other than their self-cycling, negative, self-sabotaging, depressive, hopeless, worthless thoughts, the better. These things they're not adequate treatment for depression. But, someone breaks their leg, they're in an accident. You're showing care, recognizing the natural healing process, the medical process has to take hold and play through. But these are the things that we help so that they don't feel alone in this process. And that's really critical because, again, depression is such an isolating illness. It will make you believe you're alone, no one cares, no one notices me, which means nobody would care or notice if I wasn't here. And without other people just pushing through those barriers of distorted thinking, someone that's depressed could very easily start to believe those lies and then act on them.
One thing to add to that. If you don't know what to say to someone, it's okay to say, I don't know what you're going through, but how can I listen? And how can I help? Because it's perfectly okay. You don't have to understand it. You don't have to have experienced it. It is perfectly okay to say, I don't know what you're going through, but I will sit beside you. And that is very freeing to that person as well, because they know that you're a support. And you, right, it gives you freedom because you're sitting there thinking, I don't know what to say. You can just acknowledge that you don't know what to say and then just sit and be.
So, Jonathan, when you think about treatment options, of course we have medicines, but are there other alternative options that are available for someone who may be dealing with depression?
Sure, and obviously we are a testament to one of those primary options, which is talk therapy. Come talk to a professional with a microphone in front of their face. But I think one of the things about depression in particular, and this applies to anxiety, the topic we talked about last week, but my personal and professional opinion is this applies a little more with depression. Treating it, it's not easy. If it was easy, everybody would be doing it and nobody would be struggling with depression. Part of the challenge with depression is everything is harder. And our brain convinces us that nothing will work and nothing will help, so why even try? But even if you are convinced and believe and have hope that this could help, we generally are completely physically, mentally, emotionally empty. And it takes a lot to find a way to act on the things that would help. A lot of people avoid therapy because I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to focus on it. I live and experience and feel it day in, day out. And to talk about it takes energy, and I don't have it. We know that exercise, being active, physically active, is such a huge element to combat depression. But that requires you to get up and be active, and everything about clinical depression says, don't do a thing. We know a lot of lifestyle lifestyle choices really can help or hinder our experience of depression. And I know, Ann can really talk about the diet and other things that we eat and consume, how active, rest, socialization. So it's not just talk therapy, because more often than not, even what you've heard here today, we're sharing these with our clients and the folks that we see. It's like, how do we identify our thinking errors? How do we identify where distorted thinking has led to a great degree of hopelessness when there's so much about you that people love and cherish and we're missing and we're overlooking it, and coming up with plans of like exercise plans or lifestyle plans or one goal for the day and one person we're going to reach out to, or do we even need to in the session reach out to that person in order to make sure that it happens, because a lot of times we don't have a lot of confidence that they have the resources within them to act on it once they leave our office. And so therapy is not just talking about your feelings. And I think that's one of the biggest thinking errors about therapy. It's really about taking the whole person and recognizing their strengths, their capabilities, what makes sense to them, and use all of that in a way to attack whatever debilitating mental health condition that they're struggling with.
Ann, anything that you would add?
What was the question?
Okay, what types of treatment options apart from medicines?
I think
are available?
I think to keep in mind that this is a continuum, that there's mild, moderate, severe, and there's what we call treatment resistant. 80% of depression is treatable, so that's good news. That's a pretty high success rate, honestly, and the best success is usually done with a combination of things. But the mild to medium, some of the evidence now is that medicine isn't necessarily needed, especially if exercise can be a part of it. And it doesn't have to be going to the gym and working out like crazy. It can be a walk outside. There's also some documentation about nature, being in nature, and what it can do for us and what it can do for our mood. I've done some recent study on food and mood. I've recently done a certification on a weight loss program, because obviously there's a lot of connection to, feelings of shame and overweight and all of that. So that I've battled that personally most of my life. So I identify with that. I'm excited about trying to help people with that. But all of those things, play into depression that we can do something about in addition to talking about it. But one thing I also wanted to share is there are a ton of self-help books out there. You can go home tonight and you can look on YouTube and you can get a ton of opinions, different from ours possibly. Some of them will be like ours possibly. But what's so difficult, just like Jonathan shared, that energy drain that a depressed person's feeling, are they really going to sort through all of that and all the self-help books and everything out there? So having a counselor or a therapist is really about having somebody sit there with you, care about you as a human being, as a creature made in the image of God, and trying to help find where can we begin to give you hope? What are the first few things we can do together to bring you out of this? And there's real value in that, I think. And so that's another reason why it's so important, I think, to seek help, especially if those mild to moderate things that we talked about are not working and your situation is more severe.
I think to speak on the continuum that Anne mentioned, that's really important to keep in mind. So, right, if you have severe depression, a therapist is likely not going to say, just start exercising, right? And so what you say, because I was talking with someone about this today, that person will probably get up and leave and never come back to that therapist again because it's not going to help, or they view it will not help.
Which shows that they can be active if they get up and leave and never come back. So you did your job. Send them the bill.
So there is a really big continuum of what's appropriate. And we've talked about this in other series. It's also going to differ by the person, right? So the coping skills that you find to deal with depression are going to be very different if you love nature versus if you love to read, right? So a lot of those coping skills that you can find are just going to be dependent on what's that one thing, like if you had that 5 minutes, 10 minutes to do whatever you like that you think may make you smile, and kind of going towards that, and then starting with small increments, right? That's the other thing too. If everything is overwhelming and everything is hard, don't say, I'm gonna go take a day for self-care, or I'm gonna do an hour of walking. Okay, I'm gonna go walk for 5 minutes and see if I can accomplish that. And so making sure you know and are very aware of setting small goals, right? It's a snowball. So the smaller goals you set, the more likely you are to continue trying them.
Yeah, it's really important that they see success. So a client comes in and we decide like being active is a really important thing for them. More often than not, they've been active before the depression really took over. So we ask, well, how active were we this past week? How often did we go for a walk or exercise? And they'll say, none. I'm like, okay, well, then progress is if you do just one this week. Don't focus on, because depression, often anxiety too, you'll focus on the negative, what I didn't do. I used to exercise 3 or 4 times a week for like months. It's like, but don't set yourself up for failure early. And without success, we never get to that maintenance part where we turn it into a habit. The longer we suffer with depression, the more the depression creates depressive habits in your lifestyle. So even when you feel better, oftentimes we have to break some of those habits that reinforce or contribute to the depression. Idleness, a lot of isolation, solitary activities, emotional reasoning, basing your decisions on your life on how you feel in the moment. There's just so many things that depression will grab hold of. And we talked about this last week with anxiety, is that it's really about coping skills are just as much about habit formation versus doing it once or doing it for a really long time, one time, and hoping to get this type of like immediate benefit. If it was that easy, we'd be out of a job, which honestly, I wouldn't mind. If the world could not suffer the way that it does with mental illness.
Amen. Thank you. Someone mentioned a few moments ago about seasonal depression. And I know we're getting ready to enter into a holiday season with Thanksgiving, Christmas, and also knowing that sometimes those seasons have an effect. So, Jonathan, tell us a little bit about seasonal depression as we're getting ready to enter into this season, and how can people prepare themselves?
Well, it's interesting. I have the opposite seasonal depression. I get depressed during the summer because I hate humidity and being sticky. And I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, so 40-degree weather and it raining 9 months out of the year. Like, that's normal. That's childhood. That's nostalgia for me. Fortunately, I married a woman from North Carolina that doesn't operate in that, and so we have very different seasons of like activity and when we sort of feel a little lethargic. And it's really common, and there is more recently been some dispute of how, you know, how accurate or real of a thing seasonal depression is. But I am of the belief that it is very real, and even if it's partly informed by our outlook in mind, the power of the mind is a tremendous thing. But when you think about sunlight, the daytime gets shorter. B, it gets colder. C, that can greatly influence not only our just activity, but also it kind of can send conflicting messages for our circadian rhythm when we are meant to be active and go out and about versus when we use light as a cue to like power down and relax, even though your responsibilities for your life in November, the amount generally is the same as it is in March and April. We don't get to adjust our life based upon how much sunlight that there is. But also, we've talked and emphasized a lot, I think rightly so, exercise. And it's harder for me. Like, I love running outside. Well, when it's 40 degrees and it's wet and raining, it's not as awesome. And I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, but I'm getting old and grumpy. So, you know, that's just an inevitable truth. And so one of the ways that we can actually kind of prepare for it is, you know, knowledge is power. You know, awareness allows you to be proactive and preventive. I think one of the biggest challenges of seasonal depression is it also falls during the holidays, which tends to be a great stressor for people. And often, for a lot of people, it's a two-sided coin. It's something we really look forward to, but isn't it amazing how many people are ready for the holiday season to be over by the time you get to a certain point? So there's something about it that we almost set ourselves up for pain and suffering, something that we really look forward to. I am a big believer in adjusting expectations. We tend to be too hard on ourselves. There may be exceptions, but I tend to find the American way of living, and I would even say the Christian worldview of living, like, we tend to be really hard on ourselves. We tend to expect a lot from ourselves. And it's okay to be a little bit more minimalist and a little bit more what I call essential. You know, there's sort of a philosophy of essentialism, like really break it down to those core things that really define you as a person, your beliefs, your family values, what you want, and then learn to let go and table a lot of the other things. Because when it comes to seasonal depression, there is the cognitive, the emotional piece, but there is the lifestyle element. Part of what makes the summertime so enthralling for people is the carefree nature of not being in school and having longer days and then just all of these things that reinforce fun and carefreeness. There's a lot about the holiday season. There's a lot about the fall and winter where from our lifestyle we add more demands, we add more pressure and stress. We haven't talked too much about this, but there's just a strong correlation between anxiety and depression. The more stressed you are, the more you tend to overextend and exhaust yourself. The more you exhaust yourself, it's harder to keep engaging in the things that you believe to be of value, and we tend to crash. And so those would be a couple ideas that I have, and I know there's certainly a lot more to be said about seasonal depression.
I would just add that I do think there's some evidence that things like vitamin D, some light therapy, things of that nature, because it is a biochemical thing that happens to some people. If it's happened season after season, it most likely is biological. And of course, all the things Jonathan mentioned still fit, because if we overwork ourselves and overdo, it's going to make it worse. But there are some good treatments for seasonal affective disorder. There are some medications they're finding if they do it ahead of time, they can maybe head it off a little bit. That's still debatable, but it does seem to work that way. As far as the holidays, interestingly, when you work in healthcare, you realize how many patients we lose in November, December, January. I've worked in intensive care units and with cancer patients, and we're already seeing that happen. So just because of that, it means that a lot of people that we know have lost loved ones around the holidays, and that's kind of in our mindset. So I think that can contribute to it being, some grief that gets kind of, I know we're going to talk about that another time, but that kind of gets hooked in with all the joys. Plus, we lead pretty busy lives all the time, year round. And then all of a sudden we think we have time for all these parties and all these get-togethers, and all of a sudden we think we have more money and we can buy tons of gifts for everybody. I'm just being, extreme, but the reality is we really need to step back and prioritize what's important and meaningful for us in the holidays, and to conserve our energy, especially if we suffer from something like seasonal affective disorder.
The only thing I'd add, not about seasonal affective disorder, but about holidays and depression. So if you know that you have depression, or you have a family member with depression and the holidays are coming and it has a history of getting bad, there are things that you can do to prepare, and that's probably the biggest piece of advice. So, right, holidays bring up feelings of grief. You think back on fond memories, can bring up that. But it also brings up chaos, and not all families get along. And you may need an escape route to get away from said family member during the holidays. And we kind of joke about that, right? That if someone's coming my way, I'm going to go this way when, such and such aunt is there. But there's a truth behind that, and that if you really do have someone suffering from depression and you're going into the holiday season, making sure that there's a plan in place, making sure that that person knows, what they're gonna do, how they're gonna handle it, make sure, if they don't have the energy to go out, is there someone that can go with them and help them to do the things that they do? And so really being mindful that the holiday season does add that level, and that there is a lot of things you can do if planning in advance to try and help ease the time through the holiday season.
Thank you for your questions that you're already sending in to us. So we're going to enter into a period of some questions. And Ann, I'm going to send the first one to you. Does depression display itself differently in men and women?
Not always, but yes, a lot of times. I think Jonathan alluded to that. Anger can be what we see often in irritability. I think more often in men than in women. They're not as likely to be comfortable in talk therapy. Getting them there sometimes is difficult. I find once they get there, sometimes they kind of, like, I'm here, I'm going to finally let it all out. And but I've seen some really powerful changes in people, particularly men with anger issues, where a combination of medication and therapy, it's just amazing. And so I know we're not getting deep into medication. We are not prescribers, but I really would just want to share that, like, if you're on an antidepressant, or you need an antidepressant or a medication of similar type, that don't feel guilty about that. That's medical care, and for some types of depression, it can make such a difference and allow you to be more of who you were created to be. And so I do think that they can make a difference for both men and women. That's probably the biggest difference I see. The others might have more to share as well.
Well, and you hit it on the head. Men tend to be much more ambivalent or resistant. It's normally the leverage of a spouse, a parent, or an employer that will get them there. I estimate about 90% of the people that I see, it's not their idea to come and see me, and it really hurts my feelings, and I spend all day crying about how much they don't value me, which is really what good therapy is about, how much you value your therapist. But again, because of that, there's this stigma around mental health, and there's been a stigma, especially around men and mental health, about that openness to be able to talk about things that they might find to really challenge their masculinity or their identity or their concepts of being a man, which is just a load. I don't have time to describe all the adjectives of what I think about that. But it really fits into men and mental health tend to be self-destructive. It's a very self-destructive pattern. A lot of men will come in, you'll see substance-related issues.
And even pornography.
And pornography, things that numb them, that give them some sense of momentary relief, release, escapism, numb out the pain. But because of that self-destructive, it oftentimes, negative coping for men oftentimes doesn't help the depression, and it pushes away other people and things that are immensely valuable to helping them conquer or address the problems they're facing.
So Morgan, here's a question for you. What's the best thing to do if someone you know is exhibiting signs of depression, but they don't want to admit that that could be the problem?
Continue to sit by them and encourage them, right? With any mental health issue, with any just human issue, the person has to want to do something, right? You just heard about with 90%, right? 90% of people, they're not the first one. Encouraging them, hey, I care about you. I'm really noticing that. Is that anything I can help you with? Do you want to talk about it? Do you want to, and you can get to a point and say, like, are you interested in seeing someone? Can I help you find a resource? Half of the problem with people experiencing depression is that, right, that's another task they have to do. So even if they're not necessarily admitting it, the thought of, oh, now I have to find a therapist is just another thing to add to the list. So really encouraging them, continuing to listen, and then, as you can and as you have that trust and relationship, continue to encourage them to seek help. Whether it's going and seeing a primary care doctor to rule out something medical, whether, right? By the way, primary care doctors assess and screen for depression and anxiety too. That's a part of a primary care doctor. But, or saying, can I help you find a therapist? Hey, I have these resources. Do you want to look at this? All of those are things that you could encourage along the way. And they may say no for a while, but continuing to encourage and listen. Just because someone in your life has depression, it also doesn't mean you have to take it all on. So there's boundaries you put in place too to support and encourage someone, but also you step out and take care of yourself too. So you can continue to encourage someone, but also make sure that, that's not the continual focus and you're taking care of yourself too.
So Jonathan, how has the pandemic affected teen depression?
Well, how has the pandemic not affected everybody in depression? And this is an oversimplification, but, about a month or so ago, I was socializing with a former colleague at a group practice I previously was at, and she made the remark, it's kind of impossible to imagine nobody is suffering from clinical anxiety or depression given the last year and a half that we've gone through. And part of the depressive piece is that we tend to organize our life through expectations and hopes. And this entire year and a half, or since the pandemic has come on, it's really been about discouragement, disappointment, being let down. And in some ways, what I observed early on was, okay, well, they're canceling prom, they're canceling graduations, things are not happening. Oh, but there's this date 6 weeks from now that the governor or the communities are going to revisit and look at things. So people would start to get their hopes up. And then that date would pass and nothing was going to change. And we'd feel this sense of defeatism and discouragement and disappointment. And if you think about it, for the past year and a half, that has largely been the yo-yo ride that we've been on, to the point where a lot of people, they no longer get their hopes up. So we've stopped that natural element of looking forward and hope because we don't want to be disappointed and let down again. But what does that really describe? That describes a way that life circumstances and the way that we're coping with it, we're shutting off a normal cycle of human expression and experience. Hope, encouragement, belief, optimism, disappointment, discouragement, hurt. And that really has been disrupted in this past year. And unlike a lot of adults and grown-ups, the calendar year, the school year for teenagers is marked by so many distinguishable things that kind of represent markers in life. Homecoming, dances, football seasons, sports seasons, spring breaks, prom, graduation. Last year, a number of sports seasons were canceled, greatly reduced, or moved into different seasons to where some people had to make decisions of whether or not they could play. They'd have to choose, or for some football players that were thinking about playing in college, they had to forego it because they already had commitments to begin that. This weekend, I believe, was supposed to be homecoming for Myers Park, and the homecoming dance was canceled. Like, there's just a number of things that more than adult 9-to-5 job, these things that we look forward to that are markers in our life that they've really had to be let down and disappointed and learn to adapt. And something is we would take for granted, but I don't know how many people are aware of, like, just driver's ed and getting appointments to get your permit or your license has become ridiculously difficult and challenging because of all of the mandates and things that are getting delayed, that it's actually like, why wouldn't a teenager feel a sense of like hopelessness and defeatism given the last year and a half and the fact that we're still living it out? This isn't resolved. This still isn't resolved. And it's no longer about going back to normal. This is the new normal because we don't know when or if we will ever go back to the old normal.
And this is a question for the three of you. This will be our last question for the evening. And Jonathan, this kind of echoes something that you told me on a phone call a couple weeks ago. That
was really private and confidential.
Well, it made an impression on me. And here's what you said. How in our churches can we just not talk about these topics, but how can we be places where people can live with these issues? So as church leaders may be watching our broadcast tonight, not just our own church leaders here at Providence Road, but maybe other places, how can communities of Christ followers help erase rather than contribute to the stigma of depression?
Well, I think events like tonight and the series that your church is committed to is a great starting point, but like Morgan alluded to earlier at a different point, like not a one-time thing, not a one-off. Like if this is the first and last time this church talks about depression in an open forum, then you all may have a moment where it impacts you, but everybody else that's not here, everybody else that's not watching, and everybody that comes to this church in the coming days, weeks, months, and years after, we're doing them a disservice. I think here's one of the biggest challenges that the church faces, not just with depression, because I'm going to use an illustration that, to me, it's symptomatic of the faith community. And I don't even know if you know this, Kent, but right out of college, my first job was a youth pastor. So I was a youth minister before teenagers robbed me of my youthfulness and gave me arthritis of the everything. But one of the things I experienced at the church I worked at was it was a pretty formal church. It was a pretty traditional church, and I generally don't tuck in my shirts. And one time, a kid was getting in trouble at the church that I was a youth minister at because they didn't tuck in their shirt. And his response to his mom was, well, Jonathan doesn't tuck in his shirt. Why do I have to? And as you can see, obviously, I greatly conformed to that external social norm. But to me, that was, and that issue isn't right or wrong, good or bad, but it's a snapshot of somehow when we walk through these doors, we have to look and act and be a certain way. Because our lives are a living witness, and we want to represent Christ and the church and our family in such a high regard. And that can really be mixed messages when we are suffering, when we're in pain, when we have questions or doubts, when our family life is in disarray. But we've been conditioned over our time in the faith community. You walk through those doors, and even though there's the great old hymn, Just As I Am, we don't tend to live that out. We come through just as they expect us and how we should be. How we should be. And Christ didn't die for who you should be. Christ died for who you are. And he doesn't love you for who you could be. He loves you for who you are. And there's a lot of people that struggle with that, and there's a lot of unintentional ways that the church reinforces that barrier and that divide. So what does it look like? It's not just about depression. It's how do we as a church open those doors and say, wherever you are, whoever you are, what's going on in your life that's visible and outward or inward and hidden, you belong here. You belong here. And then not have it be something that we say once a year or right around Capitol campaign or anything along those lines.
Man, that's great. Thank you. Ann?
What came to my mind was vulnerability. I think when our leaders are comfortable being vulnerable, and I've heard that from our own pulpit, and I've always appreciated it because it's kind of like the picture you were painting. We shouldn't have to walk in and be perfect. Brene Brown, if you've ever read any of Brene Brown's work, she has a quote, "When perfectionism is driving, shame is riding shotgun." And I think that sometimes as believers who are trying hard to please the Lord, and we want to please the Lord, sometimes we get caught up into perfectionism, or at least trying to present perfectionism, when in reality, I think our witness comes from vulnerability. It also comes, something I learned early on in my training was about safety, and everything builds on that. And so sometimes we need to be careful who we say what to. If somebody who's vulnerable and struggling confides in us, we don't need to tell everybody in Bible class or in the whole church or wherever. We need that person to know we are a safe place for them to share. And so this little diagram was given me of safety, respect, trust, and intimacy. And it builds from safety. But if we lose safety, we lose everything. So, it's sad to me sometimes when I meet people who feel safer in their AA meeting than they do in their church. Because I would like to think that we can be the place where people feel safe. And I don't have the answer exactly how to create it, but I think it starts with being able to speak with vulnerability and to be heard, and then to keep it safe.
To echo off of that, part of the thing about safety and the vulnerability is also, right, a level of realness. So if you come into church on a Sunday, you hear a lot of, "Hey, how you doing?" "I'm good." 99% of those people are probably not good. Let's be real, right? So it's not a shock value if someone actually answers you, "It has been a bad day." I think all three of us were like, "It is a rough day today," when we sat down, right? So having that ability to answer, right? We come into church, we put on this, "Hey, we're good, everything's good, we're great." But being willing to say, and it's not for shock value, but being willing to say to someone like, "It has been a really bad week." That's okay. And the response from the people within a church who have created a place of vulnerability and safety is they go, "Man, what's happened?" Instead of, "Oh," because that happens, right? I don't know if any of you have experienced it. I have, right? You tell someone, this has been a horrible day, and they go, "Oh," because they were expecting okay, or "I'm great," right? But so being able to acknowledge and say, like, "I get that. Like, I'm so sorry. What can I do?" Also just being willing, right, to sit and listen. People hate silence. I get that. We have to deal with it a lot, and it's uncomfortable, but silence and just having someone sit with you is one of the greatest gifts that you can give someone. So being willing to sit, not to solve the problem, not to make them talk, but to just sit, is also another thing that I think within the church we can, right, more than just when we have a loss. But there are a lot of other things that happen in our lives every day that sometimes you just need someone to sit there. And you may never talk, and that's okay. And being willing to say, "It's okay, and I'm here, and I'll sit."
And thank you all for being willing to sit and listen tonight. And thank you for joining us. We are so glad that you've been here. And if you joined us online, thank you, thank you, thank you. I hope you'll also watch this Sunday as we will be talking about anger and looking at some biblical principles around anger. And then next Wednesday night, we're excited to be able to welcome back Morgan Lavender, and we'll also be joined by Callie Gross as we have a conversation between friends about anger. And Jonathan and Ann and Morgan, thank you. Thank you so much. Also, if you're watching us online and you've been watching us through our Facebook page, let me encourage you to later go back to our Facebook page once the video is posted, and please share this with others and let others have the blessing that you've enjoyed tonight by being able to be encouraged and blessed by these folks. Thank you for joining us tonight, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon. Good night.